June 19th, 1943. New Orleans Harbor. Unteroffizier Klaus Hartmann stood on the deck of a Liberty ship, his hands gripping the salt-corroded rail as the Louisiana shoreline materialized through the humid haze. 24 years old, captured 3 weeks earlier when American artillery turned his panzer unit into smoking wreckage outside Tunis. For 21 days, he'd waited for the brutality his training officers had promised, the beatings, the starvation, the mines where Americans sent German soldiers to die in darkness. Before we continue, if you're finding this story as compelling as I am telling it, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, whether it's Berlin, Texas, or somewhere in between. Your support keeps these forgotten stories alive. Instead of brutality, the voyage had brought 3 meals daily. Real meat, fresh bread, vegetables he hadn't seen in 6 months of desert warfare. Hartmann couldn't reconcile it. The propaganda officer in his division had been explicit, methodical, convincing. Americans tortured prisoners. Americans spat on the Geneva Convention. Americans treated German soldiers the way they treated their own Negroes, with systematic cruelty and contempt. Hartmann had believed every word because he'd had no reason to doubt it. Now, watching Louisiana's green forests replace the endless North African sand in his vision, a cold realization settled into his chest like shrapnel. Everything might have been a lie. And if the Americans weren't monsters, then what did that make the war he'd been fighting? The Liberty ship docked at 2:47 that afternoon. Military police processed the prisoners through a warehouse facility that smelled of diesel fuel and Mississippi River water. Hartmann shuffled forward in line, expecting violence at every checkpoint. None came. The MPs were efficient, impersonal, almost bored. They searched him thoroughly, but without malice, documented his information, assigned him a prisoner number. One MP noticed the wedding photograph Hartmann carried in his uniform pocket creased, stained with African dust, and handed it back without comment. Another let him keep his wedding ring. These small mercies confused Hartmann more than cruelty would have. They gave him an American-made POW uniform, brown shirt, brown trousers, the letters PW stenciled in white paint across the back. The fabric was intact, properly stitched, better quality than the Afrika Korps uniform he'd worn for 4 months straight. That uniform had been held together with thread and desperation, and the corporal's wife back in Stuttgart, who knew how to reinforce seams. This American prisoner uniform fit him properly, had all its buttons, smelled like factory cotton instead of death and sand. At 6:15 that evening, Hartmann boarded a train at Union Station. Not a cattle car, not a freight container. A passenger train with Pullman coaches, padded seats, windows that opened to let in the thick Louisiana air. He sat by the glass and watched America pass. Pine forests stretching to the horizon. Cypress swamps with water the color of rust. Small towns with church steeples and houses that hadn't been touched by bombs. The other prisoners spoke in hushed German, voices careful, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever strange dream they'd entered. Jeffreiter Ernst Weber sat beside him, running his palm across the seat fabric like he was trying to memorize its texture. Weber had been captured the same day as Hartmann, same artillery barrage, same chaos of surrender. He leaned close and whispered, "They're softening us. Psychological warfare." Wait until we reach the camp. Then the real treatment begins." Hartman said nothing. He wasn't sure Weber was wrong. The Americans were famous for their industrial efficiency. Maybe this kindness was just another kind of weapon, one that worked on the mind instead of the body. The train arrived at Camp Ruston at 11:23 the following morning. 640 acres of barbed wire and wooden watchtowers and barracks arranged in geometric rows that reminded Hartman of every military base he'd ever seen. Except this one was designed to keep people in, not train them to fight. American officers explained the rules through interpreters, young men who spoke German with Bavarian or Prussian accents. Immigrants probably, men whose families had left Germany a generation ago and who now wore American uniforms. Geneva Convention regulations would be followed. Work details assigned. Payment provided. Medical care available. Male privileges granted. Religious services permitted. The explanation took 40 minutes. When it ended, Hartman was assigned to Barrack 7, Bunk 23, 40 square feet of living space, a metal cot with an actual mattress, 2 wool blankets, a footlocker for personal items, electric lights overhead, screened windows to keep out mosquitoes. Weber took the bunk beside him and said nothing this time, just stared at the ceiling like he was calculating when the trap would spring. Morning came at 5:30 with reveille. The prisoners assembled in the pre-dawn darkness were counted, then marched to the mess hall. Hartman expected watery soup and black bread, the same rations that had sustained him through the final months in North Africa when supply lines collapsed and every meal became an exercise in rationing hunger. Instead, the Americans served scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, milk in glass bottles, coffee that was actually coffee, not the grain and chicory substitute the Wehrmacht had been serving since 1942. Hartman ate slowly, waiting for someone to take the food away, to reveal it as some elaborate joke. No one did. When breakfast ended, his stomach was full for the first time in 7 months. At 7:30, work assignments. Hartman's detail would truck 15 miles south to a cotton plantation. The work, picking cotton. The payment, 80 cents per day in camp scrip, redeemable at the canteen for cigarettes, candy, toiletries, writing paper. The canteen had chocolate, 3 different brands. Hartman hadn't seen chocolate since 1941. The truck rolled south through flat agricultural country, cotton fields bleeding into the horizon. They passed through a small town where Hartman noticed something that made his skin prickle. Black Americans working along the roadside, repairing pavement, breaking stone. White Americans driving past in automobiles, Fords and Chevrolets and Plymouths, never stopping, never acknowledging. The separation was surgical, absolute, enforced by invisible rules that seemed more rigid than barbed wire. The Wehrmacht training lectures had mentioned American racial policies, described how America treated its Negro population as subhuman, as labor to be exploited. Hartman had dismissed it as propaganda, the same kind of exaggerated narrative used to describe Soviet commissars or British colonialism. But now he was seeing it with his own eyes, and the contradiction made him dizzy. The Americans treated their enemies with dignity while segregating their own citizens by skin color. It didn't make sense. War was supposed to be simpler than this. The plantation owner met them at 8:15. Clayton was his name, 50s. Work clothes, straw hat with sweat stains around the band. He spoke through a German-speaking American sergeant, explained the work. move through the rows, pull the cotton bolls, fill the sacks. Quota, 100 pounds per man per day. Anyone who exceeded quota received bonus scrip. The work was simple, just time-consuming, hard on hands and backs not accustomed to agricultural labor. Hartman had never touched cotton before. None of them had. They were soldiers, mechanics, clerks, shopkeepers in uniform. But the work was intuitive. Pull the white fiber from the plant. Stuff it into the sack. Move to the next plant. Repeat until the sun set. By noon, Hartman's shirt was soaked through with sweat, and his hands were stained brown from the plant oils. His back ached from bending. He'd picked 35 pounds. Lunch arrived at midday. Sandwiches, cold lemonade, fresh fruit. The plantation owner had arranged it all. Hartman sat in the shade of an oak tree, eating slowly, watching the guards. 2 of them stood nearby, M1 carbine slung casually. 1 guard was black. Same uniform as the white guards. Same weapon. Same authority, apparently. But when the guards needed to use the bathroom, the black guard waited outside the plantation house, while the white guards went inside. Hartman noticed. So did Weber? They treat us better than their own soldiers, Weber muttered. It was true. Earlier that morning, the German prisoners had been allowed to use the facilities inside the plantation house. The black American guard, a man serving his country, carrying a weapon in its defense, was denied the same access. Hartman didn't know what to do with this information, didn't know where to file it in his understanding of the world, so he just ate his sandwich and tried not to think about it. Work resumed at 12:30, continued until 5. By the end of the day, Hartman had picked 94 pounds. Close to quota, but not quite. Clayton didn't seem concerned. Told the interpreter the prisoners would improve with practice. The truck returned them to Camp Ruston at 6:15. Dinner at 6:30. Pork chops, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread, coffee. Hartman ate everything, then returned to his barrack and wrote a letter to his wife. The Americans had provided paper and envelopes, promised the letters would go through the International Red Cross. Hartman described the camp, the work, the food. He didn't mention how well the Americans were treating him, because he wasn't sure his wife would believe it. He barely believed it himself. He told her he was safe and healthy and thinking of her. He told her he'd come home when the war ended. He didn't tell her he'd gained weight. Didn't tell her he was eating better as a prisoner in Louisiana than she was as a citizen in Germany. Some truths were too cruel to put into writing. The routine calcified over weeks. Wake at 5:30. Breakfast at 6. Work from 7:30 to 5 with a midday break. Dinner at 6:30. Free time until lights out at 9:30. The work rotated cotton picking, sugarcane cutting, rice hauling. The Americans cycled the details to prevent overwork. Hartman's hands developed calluses. His body adapted. His weight increased. After 6 weeks at Camp Ruston, he'd gained 12 pounds. This wasn't supposed to happen to prisoners of war. Prisoners were supposed to waste away, to grow hollow and weak from inadequate rations and brutal labor. Instead, Hartman was healthier than he'd been at any point during his service in North Africa. The other prisoners noticed the same transformation. Men who'd arrived gaunt and exhausted were filling out their uniforms. The Americans were feeding them the same rations provided to American enlisted personnel, 3 balanced meals daily, milk and bread and meat and vegetables. The Geneva Convention required this, but Hartmann hadn't expected the Americans to actually follow the rules. The Wehrmacht hadn't followed the rules with Soviet prisoners. He'd heard the stories from men who'd served on the Eastern Front, the stories that didn't get told in official reports. On August 14th, Hartmann's detail was assigned emergency work. A farmer near Minden needed help sandbagging the Red River. Heavy rains had swollen the water, and the levees were in danger of being overtopped. The work was urgent, physical, exhausting. For 2 days, Hartmann and 40 other prisoners filled burlap sacks with mud and stacked them along the levee in the punishing heat. Their backs screamed, their hands bled, but the levee held. At the end of the second day, the farmers shared cold watermelon and sat with the prisoners, communicating through gestures and a few German words. He had fought in France in the last war, wounded at Below Wood in 1918. He showed Hartmann the scar where a German bullet had torn through his shoulder. There was no anger, just calm recollection. War was over. Now they worked together, sandbagging a levee to save his land. Hartmann struggled to understand this. Propaganda had never mentioned Americans who treated enemies with generosity, or a man who carried a German bullet and still shared food with German prisoners decades later. The world was more complicated than he'd been taught. By September, Camp Ruston held over 4,000 German POWs. The camp expanded, and prisoners were sent to sawmills, factories, and road crews. With American labor overseas, the Germans filled the gap. They earned 80 cents a day, spendable at the canteen. Hartmann saved most of it, buying only cigarettes and writing paper. The Americans provided everything else: food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. When Hartmann's hand became infected, an American doctor treated it. In 4 days it healed an injury that would have cost him his life in Africa. Camp discipline was maintained by Hauptmann Friedrich Kleist, a career officer captured in Tunisia. A realist, he understood Germany was losing. Until repatriation, survival mattered most. New prisoners arrived from Italy in October, starved and wounded. One, Hans Muller, wept after his first full meal in weeks, realizing the Americans would not starve him. Christmas 1943 was quiet. Turkey, hymns, and Red Cross parcels reminded Hartmann he was alive, safe, and fed. In January 1944, Hartmann was assigned to a motor pool near Camp Polk. A trained mechanic, he repaired trucks and jeeps under Sergeant Williams, an Ohio mechanic who treated prisoners like co-workers. They shared little language, but engines were enough. Hartmann fixed Williams's Ford. Payment came in cigarettes. By spring, rumors spread. France invaded, Germany collapsing. Hope and fear mixed. Discipline was maintained with sports, classes, and a library. Hartmann studied English, wanting to understand the men who treated him better than his own officers had. In June, painting buildings in Ruston, Hartmann ate inside a diner while black American workers were turned away. German prisoners were served. American citizens were excluded. The contradiction stayed with him. He never forgot it. Work continued through summer. Prisoners harvested crops, repaired roads, kept factories running. Louisiana depended on them. Over 20,000 German POWs worked across the state. They were helping America fight Germany. Some found it ironic. Most were grateful. They were fed, safe, alive. Escapes were rare. Where would they go? Hartmann never considered it. Camp life was better than the front and better than home would be. In September, a letter arrived. His wife was alive. Their Berlin home destroyed. Food scarce. She asked if he was treated well. She prayed for him. He wrote back, told her he was safe. He didn't tell her he was eating better than she was. The war ended May 8, 1945. Repatriation would take months. Hartman didn't mind waiting. Louisiana still had food, a bed, and peace. Repatriation began in late 1945. Prisoners were sent home in groups, based on when they'd been captured and where they were from. Hartman's group was scheduled to leave in February 1946. He'd been a prisoner for 2 years and 8 months. In that time, he'd picked cotton, cut sugarcane, repaired vehicles, painted buildings, and eaten better than he had during his entire time in the Wehrmacht. He'd gained 23 pounds, learned basic English, saved $127 in camp scrip, which the Americans converted to German marks. He had survived. On February 12, 1946, Hartman and 300 other prisoners boarded a train at Camp Ruston. The train took them to New Orleans, where they boarded a transport ship. The ship was crowded, and the food was basic but adequate. The voyage across the Atlantic took 11 days. The ship docked at Le Havre, France, on February 23rd. The prisoners were processed through a British-run facility, then transferred to trains headed for Germany. Hartman arrived in Bavaria on March 2nd, was given discharge papers and a food ration card, then released. The Americans had kept him fed and healthy for nearly 3 years. Now he was free to return to a country that had been bombed into rubble. He found his wife and her parents living in a cramped apartment in Munich. The reunion was emotional, overwhelming. His wife hadn't seen him since 1942. She barely recognized him. He looked healthy, well-fed, rested. She looked thin and exhausted, aged beyond her years. Hartman unpacked his belongings, a few items of clothing, discharge papers, letters from his wife, and a pack of American cigarettes he'd saved from the camp canteen. His wife eventually asked about his years as a prisoner. Hartman told her about Louisiana, the camps, the work, the food. She listened without reacting. When he finished, she said quietly, "You were treated better as a prisoner in America than I was as a citizen in Germany." Hartman never forgot it. He found work as a mechanic in Munich as Germany began its slow reconstruction. He and his wife rebuilt their lives and had 2 children. Hartman rarely spoke about being a POW. When asked, he said he'd been treated fairly and fed well. Most people didn't believe him. Wartime propaganda had taught them otherwise. Hartman knew the truth. He'd lived it. In 1952, he received a letter from Robert Hebert, the Louisiana plantation owner who had once served German prisoners crawfish. Hebert had tracked him down through the Red Cross. The letter wished Hartman well and hoped there would never be another war. Hartman wrote back, thanking him for his kindness and saying he hoped to return to America one day as a free man. He never did. Hartman died in 1983, but he kept Hebert's letter for the rest of his life. The story of German POWs in Louisiana is little known. More than 20,000 were held there during the war. Records show they were fed adequately, housed properly, paid for their labor, and treated under Geneva Convention rules. Some later described captivity as the safest period of their service, away from bombs and death. Yet the contradiction remains. German prisoners were sometimes treated better than black Americans living under segregation. The system that oppressed citizens elevated enemy soldiers. It was a moral failure no kindness could erase. Hartman was not unique. His story was typical. The prisoners arrived expecting brutality and found humanity.